The Great Jewish Revolt. A rebellion against the Roman Empire, its tentacles already wrapped around the world.
The Romans had occupied them, the Romans were abusing them, the Romans were taxing them.
Trapped in the conflict, Flavius Josephus, historian, prophet, traitor.
He saw this self-destructive enterprise and yet could do nothing about it, or perhaps he actually participated willingly in the very acts that brought about this destruction.
Josephus would chronicle the downfall of a nation, for he was there, an eyewitness to the slaughter.
Josephus's descriptions of the destruction of Jerusalem are incredibly heartrending.
The story of Josephus's life is the story of Judea's destruction at the hands of Rome. In 66 CE, the people of Judea, subjugated to over a century of Roman rule, rose in rebellion against the empire. There was little hope they could vanquish such a powerful foe, but years of resentment and religious zeal stirred many to believe that the Jews could throw off their oppressors. The story would be committed to the annals of history many years later by Flavius Josephus, a Jerusalemite self-exiled to Rome. The account, commissioned by the Roman Emperor Vespasian, under whose protection Josephus sheltered, would not only detail his defection, but the destruction of his own people and their temple.
Josephus is a Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century CE.
Josephus wrote 3 notable works. The first was an account of the Jewish War, the second was the Antiquities of the Jews, and the third is an autobiography, The Life, in which Josephus justified his own actions during the revolt against Rome.
So Josephus gives us clear insight of somebody living in the 1st century, contemporary with the gospel writers, contemporary with the massive change in Roman politics, with the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Nero's death, the reviving of the Roman Empire, somehow crossing cultural boundaries, Jewish, Hebrew, Aramaic, to write in Greek while living in Rome, and he makes himself intelligible to all of these people.
But at the same time, he's an extremely gifted writer with a tremendous sense of drama and a tremendous sense of emotion that really carries across the page, such that his writing feels fresh even today, 2,000 years later.
Born Yosef ben Matityahu in 37 CE, Josephus never knew a Judea free from the shadow of Rome.
Josephus grew up in Jerusalem in the mid-1st century, at a time when it was under direct Roman rule, and there would have been plenty of reminders of that all over the place.
After the death of Herod the Great in 4 BCE, Rome divided the kingdom, and Herod's son Archelaus assumed control of Judea. Some of the populace, still enraged by the deceased king's actions, instigated protests against Herodian rule. Archelaus responded, massacring 3,000 Jews. Rome swiftly removed Archelaus and initiated a new system of government.
When the Herodian dynasty came to an end, there was a period of unrest. And beginning in 6 CE, there was an appointment of a system of government called a procurator.
Many procurators taxed the population excessively, lining their own pockets in the process.
On top of it, the procurators sometimes made terrible mistakes in misunderstanding the religious beliefs. And they would do things which the people saw as sacrilege. like bringing the Roman standards into the city of Jerusalem because they were worshipped as pagan gods, essentially.
Although Roman-Judean relations teetered on a razor's edge, the Jews were not unified in their attitudes toward Rome.
Jerusalem in the first century is an era of cultural chaos. There are many different groups that are competing for Jewish allegiances. There's so many different competing and compelling visions of what God wants for the Jewish people and the world.
Josephus is very proud of the fact that the Jews have philosophical schools, I think is the way he would prefer that we translate it. A number of places in his writings, including in his autobiography, he refers to a triad. He says there are three of them.
Notions of Judaism were divided among the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the mystical Essenes, who isolated themselves far from the city.
Josephus paints for us a picture of several different groups active in Jerusalem in the first century. We have the Sadducees, very much associated with the Romans and in favor of complete capitulation to their desires.
The Sadducees were Jerusalem aristocrats who denied divine providence, conforming to the written law of the Torah alone. Their beliefs contrasted those of the Pharisees, who perpetuated oral interpretations of the Torah, applying new ideas to Jewish life.
In Jewish tradition, they're the good guys. In Christian tradition, they tend to be the bad guys. Pharisee is sort of synonymous with hypocrite in the Christian tradition, but the reason that Jesus argues with them so much is because he's so close with them.
Si è molto discusso riguardo ai farisei. Ci sono state le opinioni più diverse, ma sostanzialmente dobbiamo ritenere che fosse il gruppo religioso più importante all'interno del mondo ebraico.
The Pharisees are the ones that have the trust of the mass of the people. People really like them. Why do they like them? Well, he says that they have a clear view of the afterlife, and with that, a system of morality that goes along with the idea of final judgment.
The Pharisees were no great lovers of the Romans, and quite often there are riots or uprisings, and Pharisees take part in them. But at the same time, most Pharisees seem to have believed that God himself would intervene to change things in God's good time.
The Jews of Jerusalem believed that God resided in the temple, his sanctum on earth.
The way that ancient Jews interacted with their God, the God of Israel, was just like the way other ancient peoples interacted with their gods, and that was through the medium of a temple building.
The temple, rebuilt by Herod in the previous century on an unprecedented scale, was the epicenter of Jewish cultural, economic, and spiritual life.
The temple itself is functioning 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as the focal point for the worship of the God of Israel for the Jewish people who were living not just in the land of Israel, but all around the ancient world.
So where there were large Judean communities, they would make a pilgrimage to the temple. It was a constant array of sacrifices, the smell of animals being roasted in the ancient way that happened at altars outside temples everywhere. And in Jerusalem, it was on a grand scale.
The temple for first century Jews was the most important place in the whole world. Other faiths had a variety of temples. Almost every city would have a temple. But what was really unusual about the Jewish faith was that there was only one temple, one God, one temple, and it was in Jerusalem.
However, the Romans did not share the Jewish reverence for the temple. Around the time of Josephus's birth, the mad Roman emperor Caligula demanded that a statue of himself be erected within the holy site. Caligula was murdered by his own guards before the statue was installed. But the mere proposition of the act had stoked the embers of full-scale rebellion. Yet life at the Jerusalem temple was just one facet of wider Jewish belief. Josephus journeyed into the desert, seeking a greater understanding of his people and their connection to God. Having grown in the presence of the Pharisees and Sadducees, Josephus sought out the secluded Essenes.
The site of Qumran is located on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. It is famous because the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the caves surrounding the site. These scrolls, which we call the Dead Sea Scrolls, represent a corpus of literature that belonged to a Jewish sect that lived at the site of Qumran.
As soon as these scrolls were found, a lot of scholars concluded that because of particular parallels between things that are in the scrolls text and things that are in the description of the Essenes, primarily in Josephus, that these must be the same group.
The Qumran sect held alternative attitudes towards temple life.
When he describes his encounter with the Essenes, we understand them to be some kind of like a very separationist sect who live out in this expansive desert, engaged in mystical, messianic speculations.
They all shared their goods in common. They didn't fear death. They didn't seek pleasure or luxury in any way. They are very simple in their lives. They eat together. They look out for one another. And this was a kind of utopian society.
And they believed that the current temple in Jerusalem was polluted, that the priests who served in that temple were impure and unfit to serve. And they awaited the day when they would regain control of the Jerusalem temple and institute the sacrifices as they thought it should be done.
The Romans would destroy Qumran in 68 CE, but Josephus was unaware that he would soon journey to the homeland of those responsible.
We read in Josephus' autobiography that he, at the age of just 26, is asked by the leaders in Jerusalem to go to Rome to help free, if he can, some Jewish priests.
Josephus undertook the treacherous crossing of the Adriatic. During the journey, his ship was battered by a storm. Most all on board were drowned with the ship.
But he somehow swam all night and was able to board another ship that picked up some survivors.
And I think that gave him a sense that there was something special about him. He was saved for a purpose. He perhaps didn't know exactly what that was at first, but as his life went on, I think he became more and more convinced that God had selected him for a particular role.
We really see Josephus' future in his depiction of that first mission to Rome in his 20s. He sees the civilization of an entirely different order. Rome has these massive structures where they're working with concrete, a technology that is not incorporated into Israel. They're still using quarried stone. And you're seeing, this is a world-class civilization with technologies that are unheard of.
And he must have really come away with a sense of the power of Rome, of the efficiency, of the ability to get things done, and yet I think also maybe of the corruption of Rome. I think he came away with a sense that you could buy things in Rome that maybe shouldn't be for sale, but at the same time, the sense of that majesty of the empire and the great military and political strength.
Josephus dedicated himself to the task of freeing the detained priests, befriending Aliturus, a Jewish performer at Emperor Nero's court.
So Nero has these close connections with actors. He wants to appear on stage himself. And it's one of his quirks that he performs in the theatre at all, that he performs as an actor, because actors were the lowest of the low in Roman society. So the emperor shouldn't be doing this kind of activity.
With the aid of Aliturus, Josephus met Nero's wife, Poppaea Sabina, and she beseeched her husband to free the priests.
Giuseppe riesce a addirittura entrare nelle grazie di Poppea. E diciamo che questo passo di Giuseppe nella vita, nell'autobiografia, è uno dei pochi passi in cui Poppea è definita timorata di Dio, greco Theosebes, che a qualcuno ha fatto pensare anche addirittura che Poppea fosse di origine ebraica.
Granting the priest liberty was a rare act of mercy from the emperor. During his time in Rome, Josephus came to learn the depths of Nero's cruelty and madness.
Nero is known for being somebody who is quite cruel and savage and prone to changes of mood. He's demonized by most of our ancient sources. In 64 CE, there's a devastating fire in Rome, and Nero is sometimes thought to have been responsible for it. This fire destroys, partly or completely, 10 of the 14 regions of Rome.
La cosa strana è che Giuseppe venne a Roma proprio nell'anno nell'anno del famoso incendio sotto Nerone. E la cosa curiosissima è che non parla affatto di questo episodio, pur soggiornando appunto a Roma.
It's actually only Tacitus who states that Nero was directly responsible.
Whether Nero set the fire or not, the following year, Josephus's patron did suffer Nero's wrath.
Poppaea has a particularly nasty, grisly end because Nero gets annoyed with her one day, and we're told that he kicks her to death while she is pregnant.
After 3 years in Rome, Josephus returned to Judea in uproar. Whilst many Jews were moderate toward imperial rule, louder voices were stirring revolt.
Quando Giuseppe ritorna a Gerusalemme, la situazione, secondo il suo giudizio, era incandescente. Era incandescente perché nazionalismi, fanatismi religiosi cominciavano a dominare anche le menti dei più moderati.
Era una situazione in cui sicuramente c'erano elementi messianici di ostilità a Roma, ma il casus belli della circostanza era stato proprio il comportamento del prefetto romano Gessio Floro.
The port city of Caesarea, established by Herod the Great around 25 BCE, was the Greco-Roman center of Judea, a melting pot where the country's Hellenic population intermingled with Jews, their cultures often clashing. Around 66 CE, the Roman procurators began forming policies that maligned Jewish practices. Some Hellenists seized the opportunity to harass local Jews. In one instance, committing a pagan sacrifice at the entrance of the synagogue, rendering it ritually unclean. The Jews turned to the procurator, Gessius Florus, seeking recourse and offering him silver to hear their case. Florus accepted the payment, then had the petitioners imprisoned. Heightening tensions, Florus then removed 17 talents of silver from the temple treasury in Jerusalem. The Jews took to openly mocking Florus, who responded by sending soldiers into the city.
The simple narrative is that Jews under Roman rule were chafing from the beginning. They couldn't tolerate another ruler except God. The Romans were abusing them, the Romans were taxing them, the Romans had occupied them, so they couldn't stand it. And it was just like pressure in a bottle, until finally, in 66, the cork popped.
One group pushing for rebellion were the Zealots, an antagonistic party who believed that the temple had been infected by Rome. As an act of provocation, they cancelled all sacrifices devoted to Nero.
The Zealots got their name for zeal, and they're really waiting for God to come and intervene and get rid of Rome. They think that if they take up arms and if they start the fight, God will come and finish the fight for them.
The splinter group of Sicarii were even more extreme, committing a series of atrocities to force the population into open war against Rome.
The Sicarii were urban terrorists who were so called because they used daggers. The Latin word for dagger is sica. They would sneak up behind the person they wanted to murder and whip out their dagger from under their clothing and stab them in the back.
And Josephus calls that Sicarii activity.
So they were full of confidence that if we rebel against Rome, then God will step in and help us no matter what the odds look like. Now, Josephus had just come back from Rome, and he had seen what the odds look like.
I endeavored to put a stop to these tumultuous persons and persuade them to change their minds, laying before their eyes whom it was that they were going to fight.
He was a moderate. He did not believe in the rebellion. He wanted to find a modus vivendi with the Romans. However, once the rebellion was underway, then he felt constrained to cast his lot with one side or the other, and he could not capitulate to the Romans. He sided with the rebels.
When the Jews revolted, they set up a provisional government, and they divided the country into a series of districts which were put under the control of military governors. Josephus was appointed the military governor of Galilee.
I think this was a huge step for Josephus, and I think he was probably carried away with this feeling that maybe the Jews could shake off Roman rule.
Just as predicted, retaliation to the uprising came from the north, and Josephus's district of Galilee formed the first front. To quell the Jews, Nero appointed Vespasian, a veteran of wars in Britain and Germany.
Vespasian gets into this war because of his apparently unthreatening nature to Nero.
Vespasian is the most unexpected person to rise through Roman society. He comes from the second layer of Roman society. He's an equestrian, he's not a senator. His father was a tax gatherer, a much hated profession.
So he didn't have any great bloodlines. He wasn't somebody who could possibly derail Nero, who was a scion of the Julio-Claudian family with a great heritage.
Vespasian was, however, seen as the right man for the job, and he brought with him Titus to battle the uprising.
Titus is Vespasian's elder son, and he is taken on campaign with him. Titus is a kind of trustworthy pair of hands. He's seen as a good military leader. He's still a young man, but like his father Vespasian, he's seen as somebody who is fair and popular with the troops, which is becoming increasingly important in Rome.
It's possible that Vespasian thought his mere arrival with 3 legions and 60,000 auxiliary troops would intimidate the rebels into submission.
When Vespasian turns up in the province, he wants to get to Jerusalem, and so he wants to get rid of local resistance on the way, and it's done in a fairly brutal fashion.
Vespasian and Titus began their march across the country, moving from west to east. Any city that opened its gates to the Romans was occupied, while those that refused were crushed. Eventually, the wider forces descended upon a town in Lower Galilee named Yotiparta.
Josephus has this reputation for being a coward and a weakling, but in fact, he's the only person we know in this conflict who put himself in harm's way very deliberately.
Yotiparta would become synonymous with the name Josephus. There, his reputation would be made, or in some eyes, broken.
It's right on the top of a hill. 3 sides have sheer cliffs. There's only one way that's accessible, and it's also largely hidden by the surrounding hills.
Josephus knew they couldn't withstand an extended siege. The township relied on a limited water supply. With 40,000 people inside the walls, they simply wouldn't last.
The people are in a very well fortified town, but about to face an army that they can't beat.
He writes back to Jerusalem and says, essentially, what should I do? If you want me to put up any kind of resistance here, please send an army for me to do that. But of course, they have no army to send.
Now, he wants to run away, and they tell him, no, you can't run away, because we need you to stay and help us defend the place.
In early June 67, Vespasian and Titus arrived, pitching their camp north of the town, its only accessible side.
So you've got this display of these well-armed legionaries glinting in the sunlight, looking incredible and intimidating, even to another army, let alone a civilian population. They were systematically building their siege works, gradually hemming the Judeans in this town and making ready their last assault.
Josephus persevered, engineering schemes to keep the Romans at bay.
He had absolutely nothing at his disposal, no army. He's facing 60,000 of the finest, most professional soldiers in the world, and he has nothing. But he says, I still held them off.
To give Josephus some credit, he does seem to be quite good at coming up with ruses to try and subvert the Roman activities, including at one point throwing water out the sides to try and persuade the Romans that they actually have vast amounts of water in the city, even though actually they don't.
He says, I did everything possible, but hey, obviously after about 6 weeks, they overran the place.
On the 47th day of the siege, there was a thick mist. A band of Romans, led by Titus himself, made their final move against the walls of Yotiparta. Once inside, they cut the throats of the guards on watch and opened the gates to the wrath of Rome. As the legionaries flooded into the city, they showed no mercy.
The Romans so well remembered their suffering during the siege that they spared none, nor pitied any.
We're told that 40,000 Jews were killed at the end of this siege, and only 1,200 taken into slavery. So that's a very unequal number. Usually you take all of the women and children into slavery.
Josephus, however, managed to evade the slaughter.
At the end of the siege, Josephus, along with 40 other men, found themselves in a cave hiding from the Romans.
Now, Josephus decides he wants to just escape. Yeah, the Romans will get the other guys. What can I do? I'm the commander. I'm a big shot. I'm getting out of here, right? So they take out their swords and tell them, you're not going anywhere.
And the other people there suggested that they kill themselves rather than hand themselves over to Rome. Josephus wasn't very keen on that, though. He was much more of the opinion that they should simply give themselves up.
The situation seemed hopeless, but as the rebels hid, Josephus claimed that God visited his dreams.
God had been kind of speaking to him in these dreams, that he still had a lot left to do in his life. And part of what he had to do was predict the future.
He claims that he had a communication from God that told him one of the prophecies in the Hebrew scriptures actually referred to Vespasian. The prophecy was that from Judea would come a star who would become a ruler over the nations.
Josephus, assured of God's plan for him, was resolved to survive the cave and pursue his divine purpose.
Josephus gives a big speech, and he has this fascinating view of rhetoric as the ability of a great orator to move people.
Preaching the immoralities of suicide, Josephus suggested an alternative that would not violate God's law.
Let's just trust our future to fate. Let's just draw lots. The guy who's number one dies first at the hands of number two. Number two dies at the hands of number three. Nobody can predict the lots, and therefore nobody can rig the system.
Josephus cast the lots, trusting God's hand would guide the outcome.
You'll never guess what happened. By the lots, I was left last with one other guy. He says, should we attribute it to divine providence or to fortune? Who's to say? But anyway, I was left with one other guy at the end, so I persuaded him that we should both live.
There's no indication in the story that anyone cheated on lots. So he intimates that maybe it's divine protection.
If only we could interview the other survivor of that suicide pact, we would have a better sense of what actually happened in that cave. We have to read Josephus' account and try to imagine how he is defending himself, how he is portraying his decision, and so on. And he clearly is uncomfortable with his betrayal of his colleagues by not following through and committing suicide.
I think it's safe to say that nobody really believes Josephus, that this is entirely the will of God. Most people think that he rigged things in some way, and that earned for Josephus the title of traitor for many centuries later.
Josephus was brought to the Roman camp.
He arrives in the Roman camp, and sure enough, he's toast. He's going to be killed. There are demands from all the officers, kill him, lynch him.
And he's a rebel general, which means he's a criminal from Roman point of view. It could have been very perilous. On the other hand, the Romans also knew how to be gallant, and he did turn himself over.
It was only Titus. He took pity on him, and he interceded with his father to spare Josephus's life.
Josephus assumed the role of prophet, announcing what God had told him. Vespasian would soon be emperor of Rome.
It seems very unlikely that Vespasian would ever get to be emperor at this point. It would make no sense. He's much too lowly to ever be considered as emperor.
Vespasian, however, was intrigued. He opted to spare Josephus's life, and for the next 2 years, the prophet remained a prisoner of the Romans. In Rome, Nero was later accused as an enemy of the people and attempted suicide. But losing his nerve, he forced his secretary to perform the task. Suffering a power vacuum, the Roman Empire was fractured as powerful men sought the imperial robes. And so began the year of the 4 emperors. The first emperor, Galba, was assassinated. The second, Otho, committed suicide after only a few weeks. Vitellius reigned briefly before he was executed publicly and his body dragged through the streets. Finally, in the year 69 CE, Josephus's prophecy came true. The legions threw their support behind Vespasian, and he was proclaimed emperor.
If the claim that an Oriental priest had prophesied on the basis of Eastern wisdom Vespasian's rise to the imperial throne, that was something which was useful for Vespasian.
Vespasian was probably not passive in this process. He probably had his agents in Rome working on making him the emperor.
Vespasian returned to Rome, leaving Titus to pacify Judea. Josephus assumed the role of advisor to the imperial heir. In the spring of 70 CE, Titus reached Jerusalem. The Roman plan had always been to isolate the city, leaving it to last.
The Romans have one main tactic with sieges, which is to close the city and batter the walls into submission. And that is what they do. And it's a problem with Jerusalem because it's so well fortified, so it takes a long time.
By the time Titus starts his siege of Jerusalem, the city was swollen with refugees, Jewish refugees who had poured in from the other parts of the country, so the population was much bigger than the ordinary population was.
With access to the countryside cut off, the city's food and water supply was quickly overstrained. To exacerbate the issue, Titus allowed pilgrims entrance to Jerusalem. However, he did not let them leave.
Some of the people in the city tried to escape. If they were caught by the Romans, they were either crucified outside the walls of the city, as an example to the Jews inside the city, or they had their hands cut off and they were returned to the city with their hands cut off.
Some people start pushing for surrender, other people start pushing for all the more strict adherence to God's will, which is, of course, rebellion against Rome. And if we all were really consistent enough, of course, God will have to step in at the last moment.
The city was divided among different rebel factions. that were fighting among themselves. So they were actually killing each other off and fighting for control. These were really bloodthirsty factions.
Among those clashing for dominance were the Zealots, who had lost sight of their common enemy.
On the one hand, they were fighting over who would lead the revolt, but who would lead the revolt is the ones that control the temple. So you have this constant battling over the temple, and these groups are killing one another, and they're killing one another as much or more than the Romans.
In fact, Vespasian's advice at first is simply to leave them at it because they're going to kill themselves off. They don't need any Roman intervention.
But Titus strengthened his grip on the city, ensuring that the pressure he inflicted outside the battlements equaled the tensions within.
Now, during Titus's siege of the town, things reach a real head because these factions are fighting with each other, and each of them is guarding the gate so that nobody leaves.
Anybody caught by the rebel leaders inside the city who was trying to escape was punished. And there's a point where Josephus describes even an instance of cannibalism.
Josephus even tells us a story about a woman called Mary who was driven to such extreme of hunger that she ate her baby, her child. And that for him is the most horrific thing in the entire siege.
Jerusalem's state of famine intensified when the desperate rebels set fire to their own food stores.
If you could create a situation where there's no food, they would have no choice but to attack as opposed to simply defending.
We have to force God's hand. The situation has to become really, really dire before God is going to move in, so let's move things along.
Now, you could make a case, considering the nature of the water supply and other things like that, that they could have just stayed there forever until the Romans got tired. But they weren't going to do it. There was no food anymore. They had no choice but to attack the Romans.
With Roman casualties mounting, Josephus was sent to make an impassioned plea before the city walls, calling the Jews to lay down their arms.
He argues, first of all, that you can't win against the Romans. Second of all, that God must be on their side. Third of all, that the job of the Jews to protect themselves and their temple requires that they surrender to the Romans before being totally destroyed.
Josephus reached into Jewish doctrine, appealing to his people's deep sense of history.
The biblical story shows us that we have never prevailed when we have taken up arms, and that, in fact, when we haven't taken up arms, we have always achieved peace.
We don't really need to rebel because we could, in fact, live well as Jews under Roman rule.
God is our protector. God will look after us, so surrender to the Romans.
But all his words fell on deaf ears, and Josephus was wounded making his escape. After 8 months besieging the city, Titus concentrated his efforts battering Jerusalem's series of walls.
They went through that wall with battering rams and then began to slaughter like crazy.
The Romans, you have to imagine, a highly trained army, weaponized, battle-hardened, frustrated with this long, drawn-out war in this desert country, came in and slaughtered the local population.
And Josephus actually writes about the Romans breaking the sidewalk over the sewers so as to be able to kill the people beneath them, and sections of such sidewalk pavement have been found, which were deliberately broken from above.
The Romans killed anyone they met, obstructing the lanes with their dead bodies to such a degree that the fire of many houses was quenched by the blood.
Josephus's descriptions of the destruction of Jerusalem, of the environment in Jerusalem prior to the burning of the temple, are incredibly heartrending. And you feel not only his own artistic talent, but his deep emotive connection to his compatriots in Jerusalem.
Ecco, sulla distruzione di Gerusalemme lui ha parole di grandissimo lutto e dolore, questo non c'è dubbio. La descrizione che fa nell'autobiografia delle rovine, delle macerie, è veramente impressionante e denota sicuramente che già in età matura egli ha ancora serba in sé il ricordo di questo dramma infinito.
There was rampant killing, stealing, rape, and only when Titus got into the city did he stop his men.
Titus himself had not intended to destroy the city. He wanted to take the city and keep it as a jewel for Rome and, reestablish it on a sounder footing.
The Roman soldiers overcame the various rebel factions, hacking their way toward the temple.
And the way Josephus tells the story, the temple happened to be destroyed because one of Titus's soldiers, who Josephus says seems to have been moved by a supernatural impulse, that's a literal quote, threw a torch into the temple, and it proved impossible to put out the flames, which caught very quickly. And by the time Titus heard of this, and he was, of course, very distraught about this, but he couldn't do anything about it, the flames had gone so far that they could not be put out.
Josephus is always writing for his audience. And we should understand that the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem would have been akin to destroying a great historical cultural monument for the Romans, something which they were loath to do. In general, Romans valued and respected antiquity.
According to Josephus, Titus's opinion was that we should under no circumstances destroy the temple. It's not the type of thing civilized people will do. It's not a pious thing to do. Which of course leaves the question, so how did it happen that the temple was destroyed? Because Titus was the commander-in-chief.
This magnet for Jewish love was finished. And it's even more than that, because in ancient thinking, every people was tied to its place of origin. And this was the place of origin of the Jews. So all of that was, in an instant, ended.
According to Josephus, 1.1 million people were killed and 550,000 were taken into captivity. It was rampant slaughter. Whilst the Jewish people would forever mourn the loss of the temple, the Romans would memorialize it.
The Arch of Titus is built at the edge of the Roman Forum, and it's an arch put there by Titus's brother Domitian.
The Arch of Titus shows the Roman soldiers carrying away the great religious objects of the temple. Now we have to remember that in ancient times, when you sacked the temple, you carried away its gods. Now, of course, the Jews don't have any gods because the Jewish God was understood to be invisible, something that the Romans thought was insane. How could anybody have an invisible God? But nonetheless, they thought he was invisible, so they didn't have any statues. So what could you carry away? You could carry the lampstand, you could carry the incense altar. All of that stuff is shown on the Arch of Titus, which commemorates the carrying away of the temple treasures of Jerusalem as if it was the God being led into exile in Rome.
The temple may have fallen, but the Jewish revolt was not yet over. There were those who had escaped the horrors of Jerusalem and fled toward the Dead Sea. There, in the fortress of Masada, they would make one last great stand against the empire.
Masada is a fortress in the desert. It was built by Herod I with beautiful palaces on top. But it's an extremely difficult place to get at, almost inaccessible.
It rises way above the level of all the surroundings, and therefore commands an unbelievable defensive position.
In order to mop up the last pockets of Jewish resistance, Titus and Vespasian sent an elite force to Masada in 73 CE.
The 10th Fretensis is a legion led by Lucius Flavius Silva, And they've had various achievements. They've been a successful legion around the Roman world.
The 10th Fretensis comprised of 4,800 Roman soldiers, accompanied by as many auxiliary troops.
There were, according to Josephus, 967 Jews holding out on top of Masada. Not 967 soldiers, 967 men, women, and children. Many of these were refugee families that had fled from other parts of the country and taken refuge on top of Masada over the course of the revolt.
But the main faction orchestrating Masada's defenses were the extremist Sicarii, who had terrorized Jerusalem with their spate of knife attacks. Arriving at the base of the mountain, Silva set his force to work immediately, setting up camps and forging a wall over 3.5 kilometers long that encircled the rebels.
The idea is to seal off the mountain, to make sure that nobody can escape and nobody can get in to help the besieged.
The Romans hoped they could simply starve the Jews into submission, but the storerooms atop Masada were fully stocked.
The Jews on top of Masada could hold out for years, whereas the Romans at the base of the mountain had 8,000 soldiers, plus slaves, plus servants, and they had to bring, through long supply lines going great distances, food and water for all of those every single day.
Flavius Silva needed the siege to end quickly, and he would move heaven and earth to achieve his goal.
The Roman soldier, we think of them as a fighting force, and they are a very experienced and efficient fighting force. But in order to do that in all the regions of the Roman Empire, they have to also be engineers.
He ordered his men to construct an artificial ramp, an assault ramp, going up the western side of the mountain.
Built under constant fire from the defenders, the ramp was 600 meters long. Constructed within as little as 3 months, it ascended to the fortress walls.
It would have been terrifying for the people in Masada to see that landscape changing.
When the ramp was complete, the Romans forced their siege tower to the mountain top. When he entered Masada, Silva was met by a sea of corpses. The inhabitants, persuaded by the Sicarii, had taken their own lives. In 71 CE, the Flavians held a triumph, celebrating their defeat of the Jews whilst proclaiming the arrival of their new dynasty. Josephus watched as his own people were paraded before him.
Now, Josephus saw all this happening. And one of the things that one gets from reading Josephus is the amazing sorrow that he felt, complete identification with his people and with this destruction.
This triumph, however, became the basis of a whole new Roman regime. So now the Flavians have come to power, and they use their supposed conquest of a foreign people as their kind of badge of credibility.
Vespasian almost immediately starts work on a huge amphitheater, the Colosseum. And he's able to do it because he's got so much money after the Jewish war from the spoils he's taken from the Jews. So basically the Jews pay for the Colosseum. It's the biggest amphitheater ever built in the Roman world. It sat 50,000 people, we think. And it's kind of the ultimate symbol of Roman culture. It's actually finished off by Titus, so Vespasian never gets to see the finished version of the Colosseum. And it becomes emblematic of their dynasty. And remember, they are a dynasty who's come from nowhere. So this is a great gift to the people of Rome that puts their stamp on Rome.
But monuments were not the only way that the Flavians would announce themselves to history. Vespasian commissioned Josephus to write a full account of the Jewish war.
From a Roman point of view, this is the story about the amazing success of Vespasian and his son Titus. It's the legitimization of his entire dynasty.
Even in the most devastating descriptions of slaughter, Josephus usually finds a way of excusing what Vespasian or Titus have done. They didn't intend to burn the temple, those kind of lines. It was an accident.
Josephus adopted the Flavian name. He was given a pension and provided with a residence that had once belonged to the imperial family, where he would write further chronicles of Jewish law.
Josephus is writing partly for Romans, to tell them about Jewish history and to try and get them to see the more positive side of Jews and their faith. But he's also probably writing for Jews as well, telling them how to present themselves to the Roman world.
Only select Judean factions had been responsible for hostilities toward Rome. But the unsuccessful revolt scattered the Jewish people around the ancient world, as many began 2,000 years of isolation from the Holy Land. Josephus began life seeking to understand the Jewish relationship to God. When the world opened to him, he witnessed the power of Rome and the futility of resisting it.
He saw this self-destructive enterprise and yet could do nothing about it, or perhaps, depending on how you read his sources, he actually participated willingly in the very acts that brought about this destruction.
Josephus has gone down in history as a traitor to the Jewish cause because, in the end, he gave himself up alive to the Romans rather than following the suicide pact at Yotiparta.
And so what he tries to do through his works is to try and make amends for the Jewish revolt, to try and restore the good relations between Jews and Romans through works now rather than through the sword.